and he goes around to the front of the house to this little funky mausoleum that Alauddin Khan is buried in. And the door is propped open, dark out, and sitting in the dirt is Ravi Shankar with his sitar. Behind him is Alaraka with no tabla. Behind him is Ashish Khan, because it's narrow, and Ali Akbar sits in right at the door at the head of his father's coffin, and I'm behind them playing tambura, and these two are facing each other, and we're lined up behind them. And they're playing to the father.
This podcast is offered through the Sacred Community Project, an interspiritual collective working to lower the barriers of access to contemplative and devotional practices. Through the universal teachings of love, service, remembrance, and truth, SCP utilizes modern technology to promote eternal values. Learn more at sacredcommunityproject.org.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sacred Community Podcast. This is Hari, and this is part 2 of my interview with Daniel Paul. In this part of the interview, we'll be discussing how Daniel ended up becoming the personal assistant for Ali Akbar Khan, as well as stories from on the road and their time playing with Zakir Hussain, as well as one of my favorite stories that was used in the introduction of going and playing at the tomb of Alauddin Khan and the people that were present there. So if you haven't had the chance to listen to part 1, I recommend you go and do that. And this one will be a little bit more stories on his time specifically traveling on the road, and then exploring a little bit of, what it's like going into an Indian classical concert, as well as how raga kind of works. So I hope you enjoy, and see you again soon. So I was wondering, if we could jump back into a little bit of your time at the college and, transitioning into working for Ali Akbar Khan.
Such wonderful memories. So I grew up singing, and I grew up playing harmonica and in a little trio with some beautiful brothers from high school. And when I saw Zakir and the orchestra playing, and finally ended up at the college, my first year was really difficult. Because as a musician, I wanted to know. This is common with all of us Westerners, I think. We want to know what is going on right away. Mm-hmm. How do you do this, And it don't come easy, If you didn't grow up hearing it, it's different. Mm-hmm. And my first year, I remember being so frustrated one day after vocal class that I walked out of the school, and there was a little park across the parking lot, and I went a little out of sight, and I pulled out my harmonica, and I blew that thing with all my rage and anger at not being able to say I was wailing, And Ali Akbar Khan has many children, and his eldest, Ashish Khan, who also plays sarod and is still alive today and teaches at Cal Arts, or did, he comes running across the parking lot and hears me and sees me playing. And I didn't know him very well. And he says, "Oh my God, you have to be in my rock and roll band." And he played sarod, and he didn't study with his father so much. He studied with his father's father, with Alauddin Khan. Because Ali Akbar Khan left at a certain point, and Alauddin was the great teacher at that point. Now, Ali Akbar went to Mumbai to find his fame and fortune and get away from his crazy father, who wouldn't stop teaching him and demanded super perfection all the time. So Ashish Khan is a monster great sarod player and composer, and used to compose for dance drama. for these dance dramas with Chitresh Das, the big ones I talked about. Beautiful mastery over the emotions of raga and how to use that in the stories of the Ramayana. We used to do the Ramayana all the time. Or one small section, the Sita Haran, we'd call it, and just be about Sita and one section of that. So Ashish loved Western music and really loved to have a rock and roll band. He had one earlier called Shanti. The one I came along with he called Third Eye. And it was all Western instruments, and his younger brother Pranesh Khan was a great tabla player. And so Pranesh played tabla, and I played harmonica. I wasn't good enough on tabla yet. And I played percussion, and I don't know what I did to look like I was keeping busy up there. And so I found myself going and hanging out with Ashish a lot. Like after rehearsal, he would invite me. At that time, he was living with his father, Ali Akbar Khan, who was my vocal teacher, but he's got 150 students. I'm just another new student, and I'd sit right in front of him and sing my heart out, and so he recognized me, but we didn't really talk. And as I said before, Ali Akbar Khan was a man of music. He wasn't a man of words. So he didn't, engage you with charming conversation all the time. He hung out, and you just kind of were in his aura. It's thick, wonderful, emotional aura of God knows what was swirling in his heart and body and mind musically. And so I'm over there one night, and everybody's out of the living room, and it's just me and Ali Akbar Khan. And he looks at me over his scotch. Now, I mentioned scotch, and I'm going to only say it once. He only drank after he performed or after he taught, and it helped him to come back down. Because when he taught and performed, he would go off into the God knows where. And especially after a music concert where he gave 1,000% of remembering and being involved in the music. I mean, sometimes I would lead him. I would always carry the sarod, and I'd give him my tambura. I had smaller tambura even than that. And he would follow. I'd have to make sure he found the dressing room because he was not on this planet after he finished concerts. And I'd get him into the dressing room. I'd put the sarod down and clean it up a little. He might clean it up a little, and we'd put it back in the case and close it up. And sometimes I could see his eyeballs dilate, and he'd look around and go, "Oh, we're back in the dressing room." Like, whoa, he's finally with us. I think one time in the Sydney Opera House, the dressing room was so far away from the stage, and we lost one of his plectrums, and it was always my job to gather all the plectrums and put away his stuff. He had a little box, with his father's picture on it, and had all his paraphernalia for playing sarod, and I'd have to make sure it was all there before I left the stage, and we were missing one. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, there's 6. Where's the 7th? He left without me, and I couldn't find him. And he was lost. And I finally found him walking around.
Wow.
Come back this way. Anyway, how did I get on that? So back at the college, after class, we would go back to the house. So I'm talking about how I first started to work for him. So I'm there because Ashish is inviting me back. Later, of course, I worked out of the house and was there every day. So Ashish invites me. Ali Akbar's drinking his scotch, and while it's up at his lips, he looks over the rim and he says, "Maybe you're the one." And his adorable Bengali accent. I'm not going to try and imitate it. And I'm like, what? Sitting there on the couch near him. He's in his chair. And he gets up and he shuffles over to a filing cabinet, pulls out a big file, thick file, hands it to me and says, "This man owes me money." So I open it up. It's a record It's a record company. It's all letters from the owner of the record label sending him the royalty statement, but no check, and no explanation why no check for 10, 15 years. So I said, well, can I take this home? And I took it home and I added it up. It was these albums were recorded, there was about $20,000, $25,000, which was a lot of money in 1975, 76, 77. No, this is 77 or 6. And Connoisseur Records in New York City in the 50s and 60s was a specialized label of Western classical music. And the man who ran it fell in love with Indian music and Ali Akbar Khan. And he got Khan Sahib to do 15 albums with a special Ampeg. In those days, the state-of-the-art was a 3-track Ampeg tape recorder. And they took one track out and made it stereo, 1/2-inch, 1-inch tape, 1/2-inch each musician, Tabla, Sarod, at 30 IPS. Best technically recorded Indian classical music ever. Nobody ever recorded like that. 15 albums. Released about 10 or 12 of them. I called him up the next day. He starts crying on the phone. He had never answered any of the letters. Why aren't you paying me? Nobody called him. He's crying on the phone to a 22-year-old kid. I'll do whatever you want. I love Khan Sahib. I didn't know how to tell him that the IRS, that I went bankrupt and the IRS seized all the money. So all I could think of was to send the check. Send the statement. At least he knew. I'll do anything. And me, this bright-ass little kid, we want the masters and we want the copyrights. Anything. I said, I'm coming to New York in a couple of months to pick them up. My mother lived in New York. So I went. Some things are just scary. Right before I left, Chitrish's younger brother, who was also a tabla player for Kathak, showed up in California with a trunk made in India. And I traded him my tabla case for the trunk, and I took it to New York. And these masters, 30 IPS, were this big each one, right? 1-inch masters. Big. They slid into the trunk, all 15, without any room left over. Gives me goosebumps still thinking about it. Closed the top, flew home, knocked on his door. I cry if I think about it. He couldn't believe it. So I was the one. So he kept giving me more things to do. Because I was a student. I wasn't a professional manager. And so then I started booking, and then I started and then he would take me with him. And we used to tour Europe every winter. And then he would go to India, and I would tour with Ken Zuckerman, who is a great Sarod player in Basel, Switzerland. Has the Ali Akbar College of Music in Basel, and we would go off. First I would travel with Ali Akbar and Zakir and do the whole circuit that I would have booked and play tambura for them. And one night I didn't do the last gig. They went back to England, and I heard from when I saw them next that the tambura player, an Indian man, passed out while he was playing. Fell backwards off the stage. Zakir saw him fall back, and as he's playing, he stopped. He kept playing and grabbed the tambura. An Indian man in the front row came around, took the tambura, kept playing. Oh my God. Zakir went back to playing, and Ali Akbar never stopped, never even looked up. Wow. That's the way Zakir told me. I don't know. Wow. The guy blissed out. He came to in the dressing room 5 minutes later. Where am I? So after that, they made sure they took me almost everywhere with them. So that was really fun to get to play on stage with Zakir, my knee touching Zakir's butt and Ali Akbar's butt. And watching Zakir and Ali Akbar and playing tambura. Now, tambura, we're going to have a whole other thing with it, but it's very easy to play, except that when you're accompanying someone, you need to know how they want to hear it. And so, I was really tuned into Ali Akbar's ear and a little wince. And maybe I'm too loud, I have to play soft, If I didn't understand, he'd if I still didn't get it, he'd actually turn around and softer, he'd whisper to me, And like that, I got to watch how these guys would play together. And maybe they'd argue in the dressing room, and I'd go up to Zak, and then when one would leave, I'd say, what was that all about? Oh, well, Zakir, he introduced triplets before I did, you're not supposed to do, he's supposed to wait until the sarod player introduced, stuff like that. It was fun. And they would make me play tambura. Remember the tambura? So I'm playing the tambura, but then they want me to remember I showed you the clapping and the waving and how there's each rhythmic cycle. They would also ask me to do that, especially in India, because they would have a hard time with Indian press, because they would always be angry that why are you teaching Westerners in not Indians? So they needed to show the Indian audiences in India that I understood what was going on, keeping the tal. It was very important for them to show that. Fortunately now, the Ali Akbar College, in my day, there was one or two Indians for a decade or more. But in the last several decades, it's all Indians, mostly Indians, lots of Indians the parents have finally sent their kids to this wonderful conservatory. So most people study Indian music. You go to your teacher's house, and it's just you and the teacher, and you don't necessarily meet very many other students. Maybe you go to a concert and you meet a few. And the Ali Akbar College was so wonderful. Ali Akbar Khan came to Berkeley in '65 at the behest of the Scripps to teach at their Center for Southeast Asian Studies, which they brought people from different cultures. They had a gamelan, they had North Indian, South Indian classical, and for a couple of years, 65, 66, and then in 67, Ali Akbar Khan had so many students that his students said, let's open our own school for you. We don't need to be involved with all that. It's kind of confusing. So they opened the Ali Akbar College of Music, I think 67, and they moved over to Marin County from Berkeley, and it was a conservatory. So he brought both a tabla player as his accompanist. In those days it was Shankar Ghosh at first, teaching at the college, and he brought Jia Sachdev, the great classical flautist, bamboo flute, who I later got to accompany and become good friends with, and later he brought Chitrish Das, the Kathak master, and over the years he brought many different Indians to come and teach. Tabla-wise, I think Zakir started a year before I got there, or a half year before I got there. Shankar Ghosh stayed in Kolkata. Zakir was brought in. He had been, this is 74, and then I came in 75. So Zakir and I, because we lived across the street from each other, I got to spend extra time with him coming and going. The 15-minute drive, 10-minute drive to class, sometimes longer. And then when I started helping Ali Akbar Khan, Zakir is not only just a monster musician, he's also his own manager, or he has been. He has help and he has other managers now. But in those days, he really was the guy who knew what was going on with who was going to book where all around the world. So he essentially gave me my first contacts that I booked for Ali Akbar Khan and Zakir in Europe. And so we would, Zakir kind of taught me the ropes, including saving my life in London when I just started to step off a curb and a taxi was coming the other direction. And he pulled me back. If I had taken that step, No more me. It happened really fast. Thank you, Zakir. So he was there for several years, and Shakti was going on with John McLaughlin, and so he was gone a lot. And luckily, a lot of those times, his father, Alaraka, would have downtime from touring with Ravi Shankar. And so Alaraka would come and take Zakir's place. So that's how I got to start studying with Alaraka. Later, I did a lot of work with Ravi Shankar, and in both the Jugalbandis and just with Ali Akbar, and without him, just Ravi Shankar, and in India. And I got to spend a lot of time with Alaraka. And that was great. Wow.
What were some of the differences between studying with Zakir and his father?
Well, Alaraka was more like Ali Akbar Khan, all music. They weren't going to sit around and kind of have a erudite, sophisticated, intellectual conversation with you, you know. They'd like to hear about other students' lives and juicy stuff sometimes, and talk about music a lot, and but just they weren't there to talk. So on that level, they were the same. Whereas Zakir was like, almost grew up Western, which is another reason why he was so good at accompanying Westerners, because he grew up listening to Western music. He grew up understanding Westerners, and Alaraka had all this really great traditional stuff in the Punjabi Gharana, and there are like 6 main schools of tabla, and he studied with Qadir Bucks, who was a way older, next generation back, and really taught the traditional stuff. And Zakir would take that stuff, and he learned it all, and then he would soup it up. So there's one great qaida. Alaraka would teach it like this. It's a qaida rela, fast and qaida poetic stuff. So the second half of it, Zakir would take the dati daga dinna gena dati dinna gena, and he would turn it into dati dagena dinna gena dati dagena daga dinna gena. Just like, whoa. So Zakir would put them together, dati dagena dinna gena dati dagena daga dinna gena dati dagena daga dinna gena. Alaraka, da di da di da di da di dinna dinna gena da di da dinna. Can you see the difference there? Dati daga dinna gena dati dagena dinna gena dati dagena daga dinna gena. Zakir was always looking for some way to turn it a little more complicated, but he's not doing it up here as much as it's just coming out of him, and because it's just all natural progressions from the stuff that you're getting. It's like for us talking. I'm going to talk rhythm. So let's back up. So Zakir, eventually Ali Akbar Khan was like a little frustrated. Zakir's always gone. He's always with McLaughlin. So they parted amicably for the college, but Zakir most of the time kept playing tours with Ali Akbar Khan, even though he wasn't teaching anymore at the college. And Ali Akbar Khan brought someone of Zakir's father's generation, the great Gyan Prakash Ghosh, also from Kolkata. Wonderful man. Not only a master tabla player who was fairly wealthy as when he studied, that he actually was the first person to go around to all the major schools of tabla and actually pay the masters of those schools to teach him. So he studied all the different styles and passed a lot of that on to me. I'm not a master to be able to show you the different styles, but the very minute little things. And he had a huge volume of literature, just beautiful stuff that no one else would teach me. Like most balls are da-ti-da or te-te-de-te, te-de-ki-ta-ta, de-de-de-ki-ta-ta-ka, dinigina-da-digina. He had like a dance ball, tangarara, dingarara, didi kitataka dingarara, kitataka terikita tangarara, tangarara. Just it's beautiful. We'll do that in another session. Tangarara, dingarara, didi kitataka dingarara, kitataka dingarara, tangarara, tangarara, dingarara, tangarara. And he had this wonderful Bengali accent. I loved him. So he also composed bhajan, and he married a singer. So he was composing bhajan for his wife to concertize and sing bhajan. And they would teach it together. And she would sing and play harmonium. And their nephew, or sometimes me, would play tabla. And my tabla teacher, Gyan Prakash Ghosh, would sit there with the tambura. And she would be teaching it, and we'd be singing it back. And he'd kind of be playing, and gradually his fingers would stop. And she'd pump the harmonium a little harder, and he'd wake up. For me, it was just heaven. It was total heaven. So he was there for 2.5 years. All kinds of great music and great compositions, wonderful compositions. I was finally at intermediate level. Zakir's stuff was just so hard sometimes, and I was loving it. But here came this guy with all these other kinds of strange compositions that I really loved. In Tintal. Stuff like that. Just wonderful stuff. And then, all this time I'm working now with Ali Akbar Khan, and we're touring with Zakir. And touring meant in between the 9-week semesters. So mostly we only got to do concertizing in the 2.5 weeks in between, 3 weeks in between, except for the wintertime. At the end of November, we had 2.5 months. And he would usually go to India for most of that time, but on the way there, I would book him, and we'd do a lot of concertizing. And, we played all the greatest places. Sydney Opera House, Carnegie Hall with Ravi Shankar many times, 4 times. And in India, in Europe, the Odeon Opera House, which was this falling apart ancient opera house in Paris. We also played in the big State Concert Hall in Paris, Berlin Philharmonic Hall, just incredible stuff. And that first tour with Raviji, with Kansab, I had already booked a flight to Europe, and I wasn't really his manager yet or booking yet. I helped book, but he wasn't taking me with him. And then he understood that my wife lived in Europe and that I was going anyway. And I had produced the first cassette for him live in San Francisco. And that was my big debut. And he said, well, why don't you bring all the cassettes to sell, and you keep all that money to pay for your expenses? I went, oh. And you get yourself there. So I got a Ural pass, and I took the train while he and Zakir flew. And I would meet them at the airports. They'd go to the hotel after the gig. I'd get on an all-night train and get to the next city and get out to the airport and meet them when they got off the plane. That was so cool. And then bring the cassettes to the gigs and stuff. I wasn't always playing tambura yet. Sometimes I'd sell the cassettes out front. Sometimes I'd play tambura, right? That was the first tour, yeah. So many memories back there I don't even remember. So in 82 or 3, we went to India. Ali Akbar took me to India with Raviji. and we were booked at 5 or 6 Jugalbandis with Zakir. The Carnegie Hall gigs were also all with Zakir. That means 2 tabla players, Zakir and his father Ali Raka, Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar Khan. It's like a legendary in Indian classical music. So in India, we booked all these huge monster stadiums, Netaji Stadium in Calcutta, monster halls, outdoor music festivals, Ravi Shankar's music festival in Banaras. And they would play at midnight to 6 a.m. to sunrise. And they would never get off the stage. And they'd take a break at 3 hours, and chai would be brought out to the stage. And they would just sit there, have chai. The audience would get up and kind of watch them have chai. And, we get up, stretch our legs, go to the bathroom, whatever. And then they would start again. I'd be playing tambura for 6 friggin' hours.
Wow. Why would they start so late?
Because it's a music festival. They go all night long. And they were the headliners. So all the other artists would go on. And then when they were all done, then... In India, at the music festivals, there's no time limits. So even the other artists could play as long as they want. Crazy. Well, I'm sure when you got the greats coming on, and they're not going to play that late. Yeah. So the music festivals in the wintertime in India, the classical music festivals, usually go a couple of nights, 3-4 nights, and they go all night long, and everybody goes and takes a nap in the morning after the last act, which could be at 6 in the morning, could be 3 in the morning, could be 2 at night, 2 in the morning, could be 10 in the morning, 7, 9 in the, go home, get some food, get some sleep, come back in the late afternoon, early evening, and start all over again. And
was that so like people could work during the day or something like that? So more people could
no,
come?
because people had to sleep.
Yeah.
And the music would go all night.
Uh-huh.
It was allowed to. Whether it did or not depend on the individual artist. But yeah, many is a night. In India with Ali Akbar Khan, we'd go over to another great musician's house who happened to live in that town and sit and have dinner at 7 o'clock knowing we were on at midnight. Or someone was going to call us and say, well, you better get here because so-and-so's halfway done. And like that. And it would be 11 at night, 10 at night. And so there's some great stories in India. But the one I want to tell you is... So the ancestral home where Ali Akbar Khan and Ravi Shankar both studied with Ali Akbar's father, Alauddin Khan, and Ravi Shankar married Alauddin's daughter, Ali Akbar's sister, Annapurna, and they all studied, still does, a yearly festival in honor of Alauddin Khan. I believe it's on his birthday. It could be on his passing. And the old sandstone hacienda house, which had a big courtyard in the middle and little sandstone rooms all around it, still is there. And right next to it is a massive field. And the Bhopal government puts on this massive festival. But there's no city near here. So most of these people don't even understand Indian classical music. I mean, these are just the folks in the countryside coming. 10,000 of them. It's amazing. So, there's a lot of bigger middle class now than when I was there. I'm talking 1982, winter into 83. So we play a big gig in Mumbai, and we all get on the train to go to the middle of India, to Maihar, which is not too far from Jabalpur in Madhya Pradesh, and that's the ancestral home. We get on the train in Mumbai, and there's, in one train car, 2 bunk beds. I mean, bottom bunk, top bunk is Ashish Khan, and underneath is his dad, Ali Akbar. Other bunk bed, top bunk is Zakir, underneath is Ali Raka. And I was in the next car with another student. And Ravi Shankar was in the next car with whoever he was with. I remember I just went and sat on the floor in their car. Big smile on my face. Just like, I could sit here all night, because it was an all-night train. I love that. So in my heart, the morning of his celebration, Ali Akbar Khan woke me up at 4 a.m. In my bed. He shakes me awake. He says, go take a bath and put on your best kurta and meet me in my room, which is just across this open courtyard. And take a bath at this place at 4 a.m. meant a cold bucket was waiting for me. I go over, I walk into his room, he's waiting for me, hands me his sarod, points at his sarod, I grab the sarod, he picks up the tambura, he's already tuned it for me. Normally, in our situation, I would sit there with him and play the tambura for him while he tuned, but it was just too early in the morning. I follow him outside, out the main door of the courtyard. And he goes around to the front of the house to this little funky mausoleum that Alauddin Khan is buried in. And it's just this like gazebo, green, looks like a garden shed. But in the middle is only a raised sarcophagus with the tomb. And you can just barely walk all the way around it. That's the whole structure. And the door is propped open, dark out, and sitting in the dirt is Ravi Shankar with his sitar. Behind him is Alaraka with no tabla. Behind him is Ashish Khan, because it's narrow, very narrow, so they have to be behind each other. And Ravi Shankar is sitting facing the door waiting for us. And so I scoot in, and Ali Akbar sits in right at the door at the head of his father's coffin, and I'm behind them playing tambura, and these two are facing each other, and we're lined up behind them, and they're playing to the father. Now, I had done quite a few duets with them. And almost every time we would meet either in the hotel or in India at Ali Akbar's house or in Banaras at Ravi Shankar's house, just the two of them and me. And they'd tune up the tambura. Well, first they'd argue where they're going to pitch because sitar's a little higher than the sarod, and then neither of them wanted to meet the other, so they'd argue in Hindi or whatever, and I don't know. They'd hand me the tambura, I'd play it. And they would tune up. And it was so gorgeous. They would close each other's eyes and they would just kind of, one would play a line and the other would finish it. And they were remembering compositions that Alauddin taught them. So there'd be a raga. So I never totally explained that a raga is a certain literature that a scale is one part of, the emotions are part of, but you get lots of compositions in that raga. And each composition shows you how you can move in that raga. So one might play a line from one composition, the other might play a line from another composition, or he might finish the line of that composition. And then they'd both light up and look at each other and see if they both remembered it. Just this amazing remembrance. But now here they are, instead of preparing for a concert, they're playing to him for about, I actually couldn't tell you how long they played. I don't want to make up some number, I don't know, but it was a while. And even Alaraki's just, it's for the old man. And that night we played next door, in this massive field with 10,000 people, and they start at midnight, and I see the sun coming up behind the audience. Now, ragas are also geared to certain times of days. And they move in a progression. So if they're going to start, if someone's going to go on before them at the beginning of the evening, they're going to play what's called a a late afternoon or an early evening raga. And then maybe if they play another one, they're going to play one that falls in succession, and everybody knows what the succession is, to the next time of day. Evening rag, mid-evening, late evening rag, and then late night rag. So these guys would come on at late night time, and they would play. And at some point, if you weren't, let's say you're at a regular concert that's supposed to end because the hall's only rented to 11 o'clock, you could go in progression and play a late night rag and an early morning rag. And it's tradition to play Bhairavi, which is a morning rag, at the end of your concert, which is signaling, I'm done. I'm not playing morning rag. I can't play anymore, Well, if they made you, you'd have to play something that came after it, a later morning rag. So these guys would go on at midnight, but without fail, they would play that early morning raga. They'd see the sun come up, and one of them might just tear into it. I mean, you got to understand. I mean, you've seen Ravi Shankar. Many of you probably not seen Ali Akbar Khan. Ali Akbar Khan is like the instrument itself with a string, with a skin under the string, has a very loud pop when he hits the string with the plectrum, a coconut pick. And it's a very masculine instrument, whereas the sitar is the feminine version. So the two instruments are made to play together. Even though classical music is a solo art form with a drummer. And it's difficult to play with just anybody, like from a different family, because you didn't grow up together studying the same compositions. So what they're playing is totally foreign. You're not able to build off each other in the same way you would if it was someone who you studied with, like Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar studied together. And so those sessions were really just these incredible. So like for concerts, they'd work out 5 or 6 ragas that they might, with compositions that they both remember. And then the next night at the gig, they might only play 3 or 4 of those. But they worked up a whole bunch that they might play. And so then it's like battleships. Because Indian classical music as a solo art form, you're actually, in a way, a great tabla player is doing battle with you. But you're on the same team. But you're shaking each other up. Like, here's the rhythm guy. Yeah, I hear what you're playing, and you want to give them the right accents and the right ornaments that heighten what they do and inspire them to do even more. And similarly, they crank it out and they play that phrase 3 times, the T-high, and you see that ending come, you might jump on the ending with them and bam! I mean, it's like a shot to the jaw. There's a lot of heroicness and fierceness in this music when it wants to be. And then it's the most beautiful baby nursery rhyme you can imagine. And everything in between. And all these structures to call on. Well, I know this rhythm is a little more heroic. Let's do a light rhythm. I feel like we did that heavy rhythm at the beginning of the concert. All right, light rhythm. No, a light melody. I feel like candy. Here's a rag that actually has more than just the 7 notes. It adds a couple of the incidentals that you don't usually hear. It's I can go to places. It's a lighter feel, more romantic. Or, no, I'm going to play something, or no, I'm going to play something really sad. I've seen Ali Akbar Khan make audiences cry. Just cry. Even like, I remember in Rome, we played in Teatro de Argentine, which is like the Odeon in Paris, ancient opera house. Is like the Odeon in Paris, ancient. People were just in tears. The Italians, they feel the music from a deeper place. Whereas in Germany, I remember Ali Akbar Khan turning around in the middle of the concert and say, "Do they like it? They're not doing anything." And the Germans were like meditating on it. And when it was over, they went berserk. But in India, people give you. They say they yell at while you're playing. It's like part of the music to go, yeah, like a jazz gig or something. And I remember Italy. They were just really going for it. So after, these tours kept going on and on. It was great. And Ali Akbar Khan would occasionally agree to do fusion. Unheard of for a man of his classical stature. Ravi Shankar grew up playing in a dance orchestra. So if you listen to his music that he composes, instrumental music, you can really envision these beautiful dances going on and, different moods for the dancers, right? Ali Akbar Khan could compose lighter stuff like that, but he was so grounded in the classical tradition and stuff. It's like, how is he going to play with John Handy on saxophone? And they did. I saw them many times play together. And then they started a band with John Handy and Bolo Sete, who was a great Brazilian guitarist who passed away, and El Subramaniam, who was Al Shankar's brother, South Indian violinist, just as good, amazing, and Zakir. Am I forgetting anybody? They had an incarnation of it that had a trap drummer and a jazz trap drummer and a jazz bass player who came with John Handy. That was really fun to hear.
Do you remember the name of those bands?
Well, it was called Rainbow, and I believe even the addition of the bassist and trap drummer was in Rainbow. That was called Rainbow, and there was an album, and it was released in Germany, and I couldn't tell you what label, but with those players. So I'm bringing this up to say that it's not impossible to play fusion music, but when you're a classical Indian artist, fusion music is less than the tip of your pinky in terms of what you have to use as your musical expression. So it's not something you're going to run to do. And when we get to the kirtan session, we'll talk more about this, but kirtan is really folk music. And I just want to point out that in the beginning of my kirtan years, both here in Hawaii, where I played kirtan for 15 years without ever being paid, without a sound system, and never a concert and never in a yoga studio. It was just our family of friends, 15 to 100 people, sometimes smaller gatherings of 15, 20 people in a living room on the beach, doing kirtan from our hearts just for each other, taking turns leading. There was no one leader. Everybody got to lead who wanted to lead. And you reach a point where kirtan started to be played by so many Westerners around 2000 beginning, lots of people and playing in yoga studios for money, and they're bringing rock and roll and Western instruments into it all of a sudden. And that's okay, but again, it's just the little piece of the pinky. The strumming of the guitar is a rhythm. Limits what the tabla player is doing. When you're playing traditionally with just a harmonium, I'm the rhythm section. I'm playing bass guitar, I'm playing the trap set. But the minute you put a bass guitar in there, you can't even hear this. Number one, it's very hard to mic up. Number two, they're in the same octave and they're covering each other. And you got a trap drummer playing in a lot of these sounds. So the only thing you end up hearing maybe is this ring of the na that doesn't actually make much sense. So for me, playing with bands was a big challenge. But I did it because so many of my friends, that's what they wanted to do.
Right.
Rock and roll bands. And so bringing classical music into Western kirtan and Western fusion music, that's a statement I had to clarify. So if you're someone who meets a tabla player and they're not enthusiastic, might be the reason why. If they're super enthusiastic, they may not be a very good tabla player. And I will take this opportunity to clarify that I grew up hearing the Ishkan Hare Krishnas on the streets playing South Indian mridangams and singing kirtan. And I loved it. And I used to go to the temples to be enmeshed in the music. I never joined up. I mean, for me, I'm such a renegade. That part of it was really hard to submit to all that, even though I embraced the spirituality of Krishna. But the classical music is like Western classical music. It's like you need to have a teacher who shows you how to practice. Kirtan didn't show you how to practice. They just wanted you to learn the songs. Mm-hmm. And maybe you learned how to do mridangam. Somebody would show you a few things, but there's not a lot of literature there. It's just basic stuff on the drum. And then harmonium, yeah. Now, not to say that Ishkan didn't have some great musicians, because they had some sublime, wonderful, wonderful singers who were accomplished musicians in classical music and knew what they were doing. But the classical music required this discipline of practice. And a lot of young people were not ready to do that, submit, or have that kind of motivation. And I explained before that the college had a conservatory, and I never explained that. The beauty of the conservatory was it was a whole bunch of people all doing what you were doing, and you could go to anybody's house after class and practice together. And I would get up at 4 a.m, and my housemate, she was a singer. We would meet in the living room at 4 a.m. and sing our scales, like I showed you, sa re ga ma ga ma pa. Try and do an hour or 2 hours. And then I'd do an hour or 2 hours of tabla. It wasn't even enough. Then I'd go to a job, and then I'd go to class in the afternoon and evening. And then after that, I would go to one of my friends' house and pretend that I could play tabla.
Right.
And they would pretend that they could play sitar. And we were putting these fragments that we could replay, or these compositions, and playing it together and slowly work out this stuff. And there were always, if that guy didn't like the way you played, there was always somebody else you could play with. Right. Or you didn't like that guy, there was always someone else. And like that, we got better and better. And so there was a lot of practice of your lesson and a lot of practice of the structure of how to play teka, whatever the rhythmic cycle is. So as a very, very beginning tabla player, once you can play the notes, the basic strokes, you can play teka because it's not that hard. And then that means you can keep the rhythm for the beginning sitar player while he tries to play the composition he just learned in class that he's having a hard time with. And then, maybe for God's sake, turn on his tape recorder, or maybe there was an older student in the next room. Oh, would you come and show us how that worked? So there's always somebody around to help you. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and probably a good reason to study in India, too, if you can find good teachers. Varanasi is one of the better places to go. So this is a dichotomy that always existed. When I went to classical music, I didn't have anything to do with kirtan. I stopped that completely. And I was just getting started with it anyway. I was a baby. And when I left and came to Hawaii, when I left Ali Akbar Khan and moved to Hawaii, I found all these, like I said, 100 people who would show up for kirtan in 1985, 86, 150 people. And no organization, just a lot of renegades who had lived in India and studied with different gurus and learned different kirtans and brought them back. And some of them were good singers and some of them weren't, but they were great kirtan leaders. So you had all these people who were really folky. So I had to put aside my classicism and just go, I'm gonna reach that for me. I played a lot of tabla with them, but there was a lot of kirtan going on the beach, and somebody put a dumbek, Middle Eastern dumbek, in my hand. And I went, wow, I could take this to the beach, because tabla just didn't work. And then I had a friend, and he showed me basic strokes, doom, tek, and ka. And I just put it together, doom. And I learned the basic doom, tek, tek, doom, tek, doom, tek. And I started playing for kirtan on the beach. And I could sing because I learned how to do it accompanying Ali Akbar College just by chance. So I understood that these people did not understand tabla. They didn't care for tabla, even though they loved to look at it. They didn't know what they were hearing. So I could play dumbek too. And some of them are waterproof. I play them in the rain.
Right.
Play them in the water. So I ended up having a great run with dumbek, and I still use it for kirtan sometimes when I don't have a mic because tabla's too soft in the rock and roll bands. It's a little bit louder. Plus, it's a finger drum, so I'm not like djembe and kungas. You're using your arms, but with dumbek and tabla, it's just your fingers more or less. Right? So it's better transition. So you have a situation where if you study classical music, it's going to improve your musicianship overall. And so nowadays when I teach a lot of people, they don't want to learn classical tabla. They want to learn for kirtan, simple 4/4 beat rhythm or 6-beat rhythm, 8s and 6s. But I tell them, look, you've got to learn some basic classical stuff because that's where you're going to learn, your fingers are going to learn how to move correctly. And then you just concentrate on this lighter stuff after you get the finger work correct with mostly classical stuff. So this dichotomy still exists. Most people do not understand how complicated and deep classical Indian music is. They just have no idea. So when they ask a tabla player to come and play with them, they don't get that there's this whole literature and a whole amazing science of rhythm and melody. They just want to have that cool-looking drum they saw that other kirtan band have. And you can't even hear the tabla player because the bass and trap drummer are super loud.
Right.
So, just for all you folks, I just wanted you all to know what a tabla player goes through.
Is capable of. Just thinking of a nice way to, potentially wrap this up. Do you have a particular story of Ali Akbar Khan, that, really represents that kind of guru-disciple relationship?
Well, one thing that was really beautiful was when I worked for him, every day I'm checking in with him when I'm working for him to book future gigs. I was producing recordings, driving him around. He was a horrible driver. If I didn't make it to his house to do some work, whatever it was that day, because he would always make sure I was fed. So if I missed lunch and somebody at the house was coming over, there was always somebody coming to the college, just a couple miles away, he would make me Tupperware container to make sure that I was fed. And, I didn't get paid a lot of money. I never asked for money. For me, it was my dream to have an apprentice situation. And here I was, and I just needed to immerse myself in it. And if immersing myself in it meant helping him take care of his business because nobody else was doing it, for some reason his older students stuck to the music, There's reasons for that. And nobody was filling that void in his business of performing and recording. And he was only doing that in India. And his Indian secretary would take care of that stuff. But at the college, only occasionally would gigs come through or something. So when I got those masters for him and started looking, seeing what else I could do for him, the first thing was book more gigs and the right gigs. And so being there and being a part of him, he used to come to school not only on time to teach his classes, he would turn the school clock forward 5 minutes. And then he would get there and watch everybody come in. Say, oh, you're late. Oh, you're late. He was a jokester. He liked to tell jokes. So when he's teaching, he's like fierce. Or not fierce as much as just so deep into his memories and musicalities that make up whatever that rag and rhythm is. While he's teaching, his eyes are closed most of the time. But when he's done, he's exhausted, lights up a cigarette, and the class is playing back, and then he'll crack a joke about how bad they sound. And he'll laugh. And then he might tell some more dirty jokes or music jokes about how bad they sound. And he'll laugh some more. He stopped smoking, but in the days I was there, he smoked. And when I was accompanying him, I'd be, this close to him on his side. And if I made a mistake on an inhale of his cigarette, I'd suffer the consequences. So I'd try not to make a mistake while I was accompanying him. So, there was just such a love of all his students for him. And we treated him in the old India way. We touched his feet when he arrived. Or if he was already sitting, his knee. But when he got up at the end, he would stand or sit at the edge of the stage where we could reach his feet, and everybody would just touch his feet. And, to me, that meant, I'll never even reach the level of your feet. You're so wonderful. Thank you for taking me on as a student, and I love you. It's just great. You're the man. I know it looks so funny when you see it in an Indian movie or something, but that's what, in India, that's very common. You do it to your father even, and your father could be your guru. So,
well, it's beautiful when you feel that love that drives you to that action.
Yes. And we would all
when
line
it's real.
up. Yeah, we would all line up. Just about everybody would do it.
Yeah.
And even when I came back to visit, wait for the students to do it. And he might talk to you. You step aside, he might ask you a few questions. But he was a very quiet man. And he taught for 2 hours, and then he took a tea break. And I used to make the tea. My secret for how much cream to put in was match the color of his skin. He had this wonderful brown Bengali skin that I loved. And I just, a little more, a little less. And he would take a 15-minute break, 10-minute break, drink his tea. Students would come in. Everybody was petrified of him. His students were petrified of him because they had to sit there in front of him, and he was going to chew them out if they didn't sound good. He wouldn't always, he wasn't so bad, but in general he could make some comments.
Yeah.
But he would, if he got really pissed, he'd go one at a time, and then you shouldn't, you dropped your pants, man. You're like, oh my God. And every single one, nope, next, nope, next, nope. Nobody could do it. And then he'd pick up his sarod and he'd go. And everybody knew exactly what he was trying to show them. But they, it's just amazing to be taught someone musically, not all written. I mean, we wrote it. That's an American invention. One of the great things that George Ruckert and some of the older students did was create this westernized version of written notation where that's super easy, much easier than Western notation for music, for Indian notation. Using Sargam, you write Sa, Re, Ga, S, R, G. And we'll go into it in another one, but the rhythms are just a line is a beat, and whatever amount of letters are above, that's how many microbeats per beat.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be sa re, those are half notes, the beat, sa re, triplet, sa de ga, 3 inside the beat, 4, sa de ga ma, taka dimi, quarter notes. So it's really a simple notation. And somebody for the beginners would write it on a big blackboard so the beginners could have something to write home and take. For me, I always recorded it or tried to learn it by heart. I get the notes, I have the notes, but it's really something you want to learn by heart. And that was most important to everybody, including him. He didn't like people reading their notes when they were playing it.
Noted.
Yeah. And it was hard work. 2 hours, you're exhausted. And then you might have 15-minute break and another 2 hours of a vocal class. You know, and you're going to make coffee and trying, and then you got to go, you know, like we said, practice, or go fool around with somebody, some of your friends. And get up early the next morning and do it all over again. And you know, there were some trust funders who didn't have to work and they would practice more. And then there were other people that took every kind of job you can imagine so that they could work. One of my best friends was a heavy-duty construction worker. Can't sit. Well, we're all getting to that point where it's hard for us to sit cross-legged. And had hip replacement. When you're playing the sarod, that's a very difficult instrument. So he now has to play in a chair. So, you know, people worked hard and were devoted. And it was like on a parallel track with kirtan, but it was a different kind of sadhana. You're not singing kirtan and feeding people. You're practicing and trying to keep yourself fed as best you can. And the students, another wonderful thing at the conservatory, all the students, there were people, Montino Bourbon, one of the older students, would have all-nighters. My first year, I go over to this guy's house, and at 4 p.m, somebody's playing a raga with a tabla player in a practice room out in the yard, little room, little hut. And then an hour later, in the living room, somebody starts playing a late afternoon rag with a different tabla player, and it's a different musician, and the first guy's still playing out in the yard. The other guy's in the house. And then in the bedroom, an hour later, somebody starts a later evening rag. 4 different rags at the same time from different time frames. When the first guy finished, somebody else would come in there and play whatever the late night guy was here, he'd have to play something later. And we would go all night like that. Wow. And all the tabla players at the school would get a chance. I was too young in those days. Later I got to play a few all-nighters. But when I was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, know-nothing kid, I was like, wow, what is this life? These people are playing all night long. Because when I played Western music, before Indian music, before I knew what Indian music was, I was in a rock and roll band. I was in a folky rock jazz band, and we were always looking for something more. And Ram Dass came out with Be Here Now. We knew there was more out there than what we in our white bread middle class upbringings had been exposed to. But it wasn't out there. We had to look for it. And you know, we all knew that we weren't happy with where we were and just how blasé it all felt. And so whether it was pure spiritual teachers or musical teachers or all the things that the counterculture developed at that time, this little nugget was like Lindisfarne of a classical, you know, like a monastery saving texts throughout the Middle Ages. You know, I mean, here was a school of music with this guy that had more information in him that he needed to give out, even if you weren't Indian, because an Indian could come and learn those compositions, and it would be bona fide and help them. So even though the Westerners maybe never became great performers, compared to the Indians who grew up in the music from their birth. We did become good receptacles of the teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And I have stacks of tabla and stacks of vocal music, and my friends who are sitar players and sarod players have volumes, 20 volumes, big, of compositions. Because they would go to the beginning class, the intermediate class, the advanced class, and those compositions were a lot longer than tabla compositions. Tabla, you just take a page or two, one page back and front. There, writing out the melodies was huge note-taking. Yeah. So, these parallel tracks leading a merger of bhakti classicism and bhakti chanting of mantras. Wonderful world we all birthed with these wonderful teachers. And now, of course, there's lots of Indians all over the Western world. You can study tabla with all kinds of Western Indians and study vocal of all, and there are many different styles of vocal music that you can find teachers of. And let's digress for one quick second, because we talked about 1,000 years ago, the Muslims came and created this North Indian classical music, which was a mixture of Muslim musicality, Sufis, with pure Hindu music over centuries. And then in that time, there was a saint named Amir Khusro, who's back about 1,000 years ago. And he's credited not only with, some people credit him with inventing tabla, but he's credited with lots of innovations of merging the Hindu and the Sufi cultures. He is credited with understanding that one of the reasons why they're having trouble converting Hindus to Islam was because the Hindus were singing kirtan all day long. And these guys weren't promoting that. So he created in Islam. He took the kirtan music in India and he put Islamic words of God on top of it and some storytelling. And he took the classical sargam singing, sade ga 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 ga, that stuff. Took some of the classical stuff and put it in there. And he made a hybrid kirtan form called Qawwali, which is Islamic kirtan and bhajan kind of, with a little bit of classical. And so all these centuries in North India, you've had both. Kirtan in one village and in the next village, Qawwali. And if you couldn't hear the words they're singing, you might not even know which one it was.
Right. Well, do you have any, I know that you have danielpaul.com, right? In places that you could find more information, but, are there other resources that you can think of for people that want to, continue in that kind of education?
Well, actually, my website is tabladaniel.com. And the Ali Akbar College is aliakbarcollege.org, I believe. And they have a great website. They have a beginner's class kind of thing online that's free. It's not a class. It's just explains more about the music for kids and adults too. It's really cool. And Mary Khan did that. Ali Akbar Khan's last wife, American wife, tabla player, one of my teachers, and she runs the school now. Mary Khan. JaiUttal.com. JaiUttal, of course. He's got lots of ongoing stuff. So I taught workshops with Jai for 2 decades, and now I'm kind of pulled back and starting to put things into movies and doing some online stuff and giving him movies rather than showing up with my physical body.
Right.
And I am teaching from my house, and hoping to have more movies online, and happy to do more with you because you guys are doing such great work over there. And, we're so lucky that Ram Dass chose Maui to move here, and now with him moving on, you guys are creating new wonderful offshoots from everything you've learned here while you've been here all these years. So,
well, thank you so much. And yeah, we hope to do a couple more of these because it's been so great hearing everything that you have to share, and there's so much more to share as well. So
yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Good luck with it all.
Oh,
Oh, it's so hard to cover everything.